Thanks for checking back into the channel. Tonight we are going to do some old-fashioned sharpening. We're going to start and kind of tell a story between each stone, starting at a 400 grit and progressing all the way up to a 0.44 micron, which is over 30,000 grit. I'll take some pictures along the way, explain the purposes of the stone, and yeah, we'll just get started. So we're going to start with the Cheefarcuut 400. Now this is a vitrified diamond stone that is much like a glass or an epoxy with the diamonds layered throughout. And what I'm doing on this 400 is doing more of the geometry, the shaping or profiling of the knife. This is going to leave large scratches in the side of the bevel, which is what I'm sharpening right now. I'm sharpening the small bevel, which is right along the edge. Okay, and I'm trying to form an apex, so I should feel for a burr on this side, and I absolutely do feel a burr. Couple ways to test for a burr are to feel with the pad of your thumb. So this portion right here is very good at sensing for a burr, and you want to feel for the burr all the way from the heel to the toe, and I feel it. So that lets me know I can flip the knife over. So if I started this way, now I'm going to flip the knife over. I could go left-handed. I prefer to go right-handed though. Okay, I'm going to remove the burr. As best I can, using forward alternating strokes, getting lighter and lighter with each pass until I don't even have the weight of the knife touching. I'm not even pushing down. I'm just letting the weight of the knife, and then even letting less of the weight of the knife. And then I'm going to wipe off the slurry that I had on the knife. I'll dry this stone off since we'll be done with this, and we'll take a picture of this under a microscope and take a look and see what we've got. This is the 400 grit under a microscope, and you can see it's got an aggressive scratch pattern, which is to be expected when you are reprofiling or shaping the primary bevel toward an apex. We're going to go from the 400 to a 600, and this is going to be the Naniwa Naniwa Diamond Pro 600 grit stone, and this is a different material on this stone than the Cheefarcuut. This one has a diamond resin, whereas the Cheefarcuut had the vitrified diamond sharpening layers. So and what the 600 stone is doing now is taking out the scratches that the 400 made. And again, I want to go until I feel a burr on the opposite side, from heel to toe. So it's important that you get the heel and the toe, or the point of the knife, in the sharpening. Definitely a burr. You can even hear it if I hold this close to my mic. All right, we'll flip the knife over. And I'm not going to do pictures at every single stone. I'm going to do it after we get through maybe 2 to 3 stones each, depending on how much grit separation we have. All right, and then I'm going to do the same thing here to remove the burr as best I can, without going to a strop. This is going to be a perfect technique for progressing to the next stone. Okay, then I want to wipe this off. And then let's clean off this stone, dry it off. Next, we're going to go to the Naniwa Diamond Pro 1000. So now we're up to a 1000 grit. And the 1000 grit is, again, I wouldn't say it's a profiling grit, but it's a transitional grit. And you could absolutely stop after the 600 or the 1000. It depends on what you're going for. We're going for a polished edge here. And so a polished edge is going to start with the polishing stones, which I'll talk about in the future here. But the 1000 stone helps us get to those polishing stones. And so the 1000 grit is, again, even smaller abrasives, smaller diamonds, and it's working on taking out the scratches that the 600 diamond stone left. And if you don't go long enough, you're going to end up leaving, if you don't sharpen with enough passes, what you'll basically end up with, and if you keep on progressing to the next stone and the next stone, those larger scratches are going to stay. And it's kind of like, it really does parallel to sanding wood. Think of if you started with a 120 grit, which is a pretty coarse sandpaper, and then you went all the way to an 800 grit sandpaper. you are not going to make much difference by making that big of a you're not going to change the 120 grit very much unless you spend countless amount of time and number of pieces of sandpaper. And so I did have a question that came up on from one of my subscribers. It was a great question, but they asked, they were looking at getting this Naniwa Diamond stone set, and they asked, could I go with the 600, the 1000, and the 6000 grit stone? And I said, absolutely you can. And I told them a couple of things. One, never assume that or make it that your sharpening setup is complete. You can always add an in-between stone. You can always continue adding, but if you're looking to just get started, yes, absolutely, you can start with 3. If you wanted a 3-stone setup, you could start with a 400, a 1000, and a 6000 grit stone. What'll happen and bypass in a 4-stone setup that 3000 grit stone. What'll happen is it's going to take you longer on the 6000 grit stone to remove the scratches from the 1000, as opposed to if you had the 3000 grit stone to transition from 1000 to 3000 to 6000. But 1000 to 6000 you can do. It's not a crazy difficult jump. You'll just spend a little bit more time. It's a reasonable step. And I forgot we need to remove the burr on this. And then we're going to take pictures after we're done here on the 1000, just to see what the difference between the 1000 and the 400 is. All right, so we'll dry that stone off. Dry the knife off. And we'll get some pictures. So we've got the 400 grit on the left side, and then you can see the 1000 on the right. The scratch pattern is less aggressive, and the 1000 grit scratch pattern is more wispy, which is exactly what we would expect with a finer scratching abrasive. All right, so now the next grouping of stones that we're going to use is the 3000 grit, the 6000 grit, and the 8000 grit stones. Now this is where we start transitioning from sharpening to polishing. Right around the 3000 grits, 3000, 4,000, 5000 grit range is where we start getting into more of a polish. And this is going to still remove the scratches that the 1000 stone left. And you could really see a difference though between the 400 and the 400 and the 1000 grit scratch pattern, and that is exactly why I wanted to go through this with you. And we'll still see further differences as we sharpen. Okay. Now here it gets a little trickier. You don't necessarily feel, it's going to be a lot harder to feel for a burr. So this is where I usually use my microscope to check and see, or I just do based on experience, I know about how many passes is going to be adequate to remove the previous stone's scratch patterns. And the closer in grit size that you are, the less time you'll have to spend on that stone. That's something that I was talking about a little bit earlier. Since I've got a 2000 grit jump from the 1000 to the 1000 grit to the 3000 grit, I really don't have to spend a whole lot of time on this. So we're going to go from the 3000 grit, dry this off, and then we're going to go up to the 6000 grit stone next. Okay, and now we are moving up to the 6000. There we go. And if you own stones like this, or you've used or sharpened on stones like this, you'll know that as you get into the really high grits, it's almost like you're sharpening on a really flat surface. But you can still see that there's material being removed, which is, it's just that the diamonds that are removing the material are just so much smaller, but it's still removing and polishing the edge. This at 6000 is absolutely in the polishing range. And we're going to go further than this even. We'll take pictures after this at 6000 and see if we're able to still see it. And one thing will happen, that's going to make the photography of this more difficult, is as you get into this high, really high grit, you're polishing it, so it's like taking a picture of a mirror to look for the scratches, and it's going to be really bright. But we'll see what we can do with the camera to try and capture it in a duller, at a dull angle, or with less light present. We'll see what we get after the 6000. I know I've tried it at the 16,000, and that's very difficult. Basically, it looks like you're taking a picture of a mirror with a flashlight in it. It's just blinding. But you do the same principles. You still want to remove the micro burr that is there. And the other thing that's really nice about going up into a higher progression is that your burr gets worn off, or it gets smaller and smaller, I will say. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller, which makes it easier, in my opinion, to remove at the end of your sharpening progression and technique. So whether you go to a strop at the end, the smaller the burr, the easier it is. I feel I've experienced it is, the easier it is to remove it. So that was 6,000 grit. Let's take pictures and see what we get. So the 1,000 grit on the left, you can see a big difference with the 6,000 grit on the right. Now we're getting into the polishing stage and the scratches are starting to disappear. Okay, here we are at the 8,000 grit stone, and this is a Shapton Pro or Glass Pro, an 8,000 grit. And I've had my Shapton set for a long time, many years. So when I first started out sharpening, my first set of stones was an Arkansas soft, an Arkansas hard, and then an Arkansas black stone. Then I transitioned to the Shapton Glass Pro series, and I've got the 500, the 1,000, the 4,000, the 8,000, which is this stone, and then the 16,000 grit, which is what we will be sharpening on next. So I've had these for many years. I've been sharpening all together for over 10 years now. I think I'm entering my 11th year. And so so these stones have sharpened a lot of woodworking tools, and they still have a lot of life left in them. So we are, let's see, we are just removing this, what would be a micro burr at this stage. You really aren't going to generate much of a burr at an 8,000 grit, as again you're polishing the edge. And so I'm going to wipe this off and show you the edge here. But look at how reflective that is now. Down the entire bevel. And that's at 8,000 grit. So let's dry off the stone. Put the 8,000 away. And we're going to grab the 16,000 Shapton Glass Pro. And so you wonder, how can you jump from an 8,000 to a 16,000? Well, the difference and compare that jumping, say, from a 400 to an 8,000, which is a smaller jump. It's only 7,600, but instead of 8,000. But you've got to look at it. The scale is not linear. What you really should look at is the micron size. And so when you go from a 400 grit to an 800 grit, your particle size is getting cut in half with the 800 grit. An 800 grit abrasive is half the size of a 400 grit abrasive. And so an abrasive that is an abrasive that is 16,000 is half the size of an 8,000 grit abrasive. And so you want to follow that rule of thumb more so. You want to go by, I feel like you can go by the half rule any day of the week. So after this stone, I said we were going to go above 30,000, and we are. I've got one more stone after this. That's a Shapton Glass Pro. There's a 30,000 grit that comes in this style. And there is a even finer one that's part of their 7 mil series. So 16,000 grit right here. You can see again it's mirror finish. Okay, all right, so we're done with the 16,000. Lastly, we have our 0.44 micron. This is a glass stone 7 Shapton stone that fits into its own little stone holder. It's a much smaller stone, but it will still work perfectly well with this large knife. And the kit I bought, comes with this diamond flattener that we might as well use. All right, so we've got our 0.44 micron stone flattened here. and that equates to a 34,000 grit stone, which is the highest grit stone that I own. All right, there you have it. From 400 grit to 34,000 grit. That's kind of the process. Takes a few stones, but you can really see the mirror polish on this blade. So normally what I would do after this, I would only go down to, say, this with a strop. If I went this high, I normally don't go this high. When I sharpen things, I don't go to 34,000 grit all the time, but I would take this strop, which is 0.25 microns. So now you're talking about a 60,000 grit, and take this and do alternating trailing strokes. And then we'll do a proper cut test. And as I do this, I get lighter and lighter. I want to be at about the same sharpening angle while I'm doing this, and I get lighter and lighter until I'm even taking off the weight of the knife itself. So put our strap up. I like to do kind of a pull stroke on the blade on a microfiber as well, just to remove any resin that's on there. Well, let's feel this. Yeah, it feels very sharp. You can see the 8000 grit scratch pattern has more scratches than the 34,000 grit scratch pattern. And honestly, had I spent more time on each of the stones after the 8000, we could have gotten a cleaner 34,000 grit appearance under the microscope, but this video is already plenty long. All right, so we're here for our scratch test, our not our scratch test, our cut test. So, yep, it's sharp. I can do curvy cuts from the heel to the toe. So I know this isn't a quantifiable test, but usually if you're able to do curvy cuts in paper, it means your knife is pretty sharp. Eventually maybe I'll invest in a best tester and we'll see, but I do appreciate you watching this. If you've got any questions or comments, throw them in the comment section below. As always, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this with somebody that you think might like it. And Dan for All out.